10 years ago, China and the US produced basically the same amount of steel. Now, China alone produces over 35% of the world's steel, and the US produces about 8%. Within a decade, China has gone from being just one of several big heavy industry players to becoming the dominant player. One of the reasons it's been able to accomplish this is it's engaged in transferring technology and equipment from abroad. The No. 7 blast furnace in Handan, China was originally part of a steel factory in Germany.
220,000 tons of material were packed and transported and shipped to China. The costs were too high to be a competitor in this business, and therefore it was decided to shut down this equipment, to shut down this factory.
Germany is leading the fight against global warming and is one of the greenest industrial countries, but much of its polluting industry has followed pieces of equipment like furnace No. 7 to China.
大家都知道啊，中国的东部沿海地区是中国经济。
Provinces in the east and along the eastern coast of China are the most developed economically. At the same time, they're the most polluted regions. Several cancer villages have sprouted up all over the east and the south. We can't say these problems aren't correlated to the environment. In fact, they're closely related to the environment.
Hangang is one of 75 large steel mills in China located in the center of an urban area. Several villages abut right up against the walls of Hangang.
Traveling entertainment troops that project films avoid our village because metal dust and coal dust fall onto their projectors and ruin the film. They have to hold a huge umbrella over the projector, so it's too much trouble. They don't come anymore. A decade ago, many people died of abdominal cancer. I'm sure it's related to the pollution. We staged protests several times in the 80s, and once again in 2006. We sat on the road to the entrance night and day, blocking traffic from exiting or entering. They wouldn't arrest us because we were all old ladies.
I was trying to sell the cabbage, but nobody wanted to buy it from me because it was full of these polluted particles. Most commoners hate the pollution. Afterwards, we staged a sit-in to protest the pollution. They arrested me and said I was the organizer. They gave me a sentence of 3 years, 5 years probation.
那现在我们国的西部呢？
Western provincial leaders are actively recruiting entrepreneurs from the East Coast. In fact, the Western provinces currently have a frontier development policy. But what does this policy really mean? What it means is they will inherit the oldest, most polluting industries from the eastern and southeastern regions. Factories and equipment that couldn't meet energy efficiency standards or cause serious pollution problems will soon appear in Western provinces like Xinjiang and Guangxi, among others. This is a very scary fact.
So is this an example of a pollution haven? And does it suggest that the German company, or perhaps the Chinese company buying the factory, is arbitraging environmental standards? One of the things that we need to ask ourselves when we talk about pollution havens is how important are the differences in environmental standards in actually making business decisions as opposed to all of the other business issues that are involved? Steel making, and by the way, you said 35%, that was in 2007. This year it's estimated that China will produce slightly more than half of all the world's steel, more than 50%. Part of that is because Japan, Europe, and the U.S. are still in an economic slump and not producing as much, but it's also because China's production capacity continues to grow. One of the things to remember about steel making, if you've ever seen a steel mill, one of the things that you will be impressed by is how big and what looks to be capital intensive. But in fact, steel making is actually quite labor intensive. It's also a relatively low technology business. The basic way of making steel today, the Bessemer process, was actually discovered over 100 years ago. Yes, there have been incremental changes, and when you get into specialty steels, it's very different. But when we're talking about basic steel making, it's basically the same process today as it was 100 and 120 years ago. So we need to ask, are companies moving to countries with very low environmental standards because the environmental standards are low, that is, trying to arbitrage the differences? There are no doubt there are costs associated with different environmental standards. Or is it really because there are other overwhelming business factors such as differential labor costs? Remember, we would expect labor-intensive industries to move to labor-abundant countries. So that would be one issue that we would want to ask ourselves. The second issue is, are these environmental issues subject for trade negotiations, international negotiations? In here, we might want to make a distinction between different kinds of pollution. So the first kind of pollution that we can talk about are what we call domestic or local pollutions or pollutants, where the cost of the pollution falls almost exclusively on the domestic economy, right? So you pollute, but you got to live in the sandbox that you just dirtied. Okay? Well, we can think of that as opposed to, for instance, what is sometimes called transnational pollutants or sometimes called regional pollutants, where, yes, you've got production activity that's going on, and yes, you absorb some of the pollution that's generated from that production activity, but some, and maybe even a substantial portion of that pollution actually goes into a neighboring country. So here we're talking about something that may be regionally based, involving a number of countries that are either along a river or, if it's air pollution, are downwind from where the polluting factory might be. We had a great example of this just this past summer-fall, where there was a huge chemical spill in Hungary right into the Danube River. Now, if you've ever looked at a map, the Danube River runs through lots and lots of different countries. And chemical spills into water are generally not very good things. And down the river, all the chemicals went across lots and lots of different borders. There's a third type of pollution that we'll come back to and talk about towards the end. And those would be what we would call global pollutants. And global pollutants, as you can probably figure out, are things that the economic activity that you're engaged in, either independently or in conjunction with economic activity that others are engaged in, actually have global consequences. So things like global warming, if you're a believer, would fall into that category. Let's think about, for a moment, just the domestic pollution. So if there is domestic pollution, we know that this leads to a market failure. We also know the solution for it, right? So here, what we have is marginal social costs that are greater than the marginal private benefits. So we've got a gap there. And the typical solution, policy solution, to negative externalities is to impose a tax on the activity that's generating the negative externality. So once we can internalize the cost, we can make it look much better. However, if we don't internalize these costs, it actually turns out that free trade can reduce the welfare of the country. If the negative externalities are large enough, they could more than offset the benefits that the country would gain by engaging in international trade. So remember, we're talking about domestic pollutants or local pollutants here. So whatever we're producing for export gives us positive gains, but if we've got the negative externalities, marginal external costs, now all of a sudden there's a cost that we have to take account of as well. So this is a can, not a will. The second issue is we might actually be exporting the wrong good. It may very well be the case, because we are not internalizing the cost, that we're exporting a good, but if we were to take proper consideration of the external costs and we then internalize them, we might find, oh, we should be importing that good, not exporting that good. For an example of this, look at, I think it's free response question number 2 on the fall exam that's posted on BSpace, fall of 09 exam number 2. It looks at a very specific example of exactly that. Okay, so again, we know that the first best solution would obviously be to place a tax on that pollution. That would lead to a more efficient outcome, both on the production side as well as the consumption side. From a trade perspective, however, it can be, at least politically, a bit more complicated. Remember, most countries are relatively small countries in terms of geographic size as well as economic size. So whatever they're producing, they also likely have other competitors in the world. That is, producers in other countries who are producing a similar or perhaps even an identical product. And if all of the production processes are roughly the same around the world in whatever industry this is, all of those production processes will be generating negative externalities. If one country internalizes its cost by placing a tax on the pollution, it has internalized everything domestically, but it has now raised its cost relative to its international competitors. So if you're in that industry, either as a company or as a worker, you might either protest the taxes that have unleveled the playing field, or you might protest that there is essentially an implicit subsidy to foreign producers who are not internalizing their pollution costs. So it becomes much more difficult, even if all the costs are domestic, all the marginal external costs are contained domestically. If in an international trade environment, you still have to worry about what your competitors are doing. That may or may not make a difference in the broader scheme of things for the country. The bottom line is, when we have domestic environmental problems, it's up to the domestic government or economy to actually figure out what the solution is. It may require some negotiations with other countries, but it's really up to the country to take care of its own mess. Now let's think of transnational pollution. So remember, transnational pollution is where the production process takes place in one country, and some, or perhaps a substantial portion of the external cost, the environmental damage, the pollution, is actually occurring in other countries, which, by the way, may or may not even be importing or using the good that's being produced. So this doesn't necessarily need to involve international trade. Now, of course, we got new issues here because we're talking about things that are taking place across borders. Again, we know what the first best solution is. The first best solution on a regional basis is to equate the marginal social benefits to the marginal social costs, and that will give us the optimal solution. That almost never happens. So now we have to look for a second best solution. So on a second best solution, if we thought about two different countries where the producing and exporting country is creating the pollution that's spilling over into the importing country. So a second best solution might be for the importing country to limit its exports. Right? So let's put on a tariff or an import quota. If we reduce the amount that we're importing, we're also reducing the amount the polluting country is exporting. Their production level will go down, and because their production level goes down, the amount of pollution will also go down. So that would be one way of doing it. In the second sentence, just it didn't come out right. To subsidize its import competing good. So here, the country that's doing the importing may also have domestic production in the same product that it's importing. So another way to reduce the production activity in the other country is to increase production in our country. And we can do that through an export subsidy. We might do that through a production subsidy, or there are a variety of other ways. Now, trying to deal with transnational pollution this way runs into one really, really big problem. And that is tariffs, import quotas, and export subsidies generally run afoul of the WTO and their rules and regulations. So it's generally not a very effective way of trying to deal with transnational pollution. So negotiations are almost always necessary, trying to, again, approach that first best solution. If it's a relatively small number of countries, and especially if the small countries have about the same level of income per capita, so they have about the same incomes and wealth per person, and the same broad cultural, historical, traditional backgrounds, these types of agreements are pretty easy to do. And so if you look at what happens in Western Europe in particular, we see a whole number of agreements across countries because they're, in an environmental way, pretty much all on the same page. The levels of income are pretty close to one another, so there aren't any really major problems here. When you look at differences between rich countries and poor countries that are next door to each other, now getting these kinds of agreements are much more difficult. The poor country recognizing that A, they're probably the source of most of the pollution, and B, they're going to carry most of the cost of solving it. But they're already poor, so it becomes a very regressive tax. So you can think about pollution along the U.S.-Mexican border. you can look at it between Western Europe and some of the countries in Eastern Europe, especially the more Baltic countries. Not Baltic. What am I thinking of? Balkan, not Baltic. Balkan countries in the southeast of Europe. So that makes it much more difficult. Now notice that by making trade barriers, or taking trade barriers and kind of taking them out of the solution set, it really means that the WTO may be standing in the way of countries imposing easily adaptable solutions to a transnational pollution problem. And it's in this respect that many critics have argued that the WTO, or more specifically, the rules of the WTO, which of course the WTO enforces, actually prevents many governments from taking the kinds of policy steps that would be needed to bring down pollution that is transnational in its aspects. Now, having said that, it's important to realize that the WTO its charter is to think about trade liberalization, not about environmental matters. And within the context of the WTO, they suggest that countries can basically do whatever they want from an environmental perspective as long as they do it in a non-discriminatory way. And what they mean by that is that you must treat domestic production activity exactly the same as foreign production activity. So you can't have one standard for imports and a different standard for domestically produced goods. So that's the context that the WTO operates in. Now, while the WTO does not focus heavily on environmental issues, it does have Article 20, which was actually part of the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, so the predecessor to the WTO. And Article 20 is known as the Green Provision. So it talks about where you can have exceptions to free trade. So this is what Article 20 says. Subject to the requirement that such measures are not applied in a manner which would constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between countries where the same conditions prevail. So notice what that's really saying in legalese, international trade legalese. Basically what that's saying is you got production here and you got production in this country, you got to treat them the same. You can't have an arbitrary or discriminatory practices based on location of production. Nor can we do this as a disguised restriction on international trade. Remember, any trade barrier is going to reduce your volume of imports, which is going to help your domestic import competing industries. Right? So one could think of then putting on stricter environmental standards as a way of protecting your domestic import competing industries. So again, the WTO wants to make sure that the environmental rules that you're adopting aren't being used as hidden restrictions on trade. It goes on to say nothing in this agreement shall be construed to prevent the adoption or enforcement by any contracting party of measures necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life or health, or relating to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources, if such measures are made effective in conjunction with restriction on domestic production and consumption. What this means is you can't worry about wearing out somebody else's oil reserves and have trade restrictions on imported oil because, oh my goodness, we're worried the Saudis will run out of oil, unless you also put the same provisions in place for domestic oil production. Again, it's an exhaustible natural resource. So notice here that there are discussions in this language, both on the production side and on the consumption side. So let's talk for a minute about the consumption side of this. The rules state that you can, in fact, have product standards if it's to protect health, safety, or the environment itself. So, in fact, not so long ago, there was import. What were we importing from China that was so tainted? Some sort of. Yeah, well, there's been toys, there's been flammable children's clothes, but there was a big case with some sort of pharmaceuticals. I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, toothpaste as well. But the one I'm thinking of had to do with some sort of pharmaceuticals. And the pharmaceuticals were actually not up to U.S. standards. People got ill, several people died. The agreement now is that the U.S. Food and Drug Administration actually has inspectors in China, in the factories in China. So it's not a matter of, let's wait till the goods get to the U.S. border to do the inspections. Remember what the eel importer said, the Chinese government spends $1,300 per container to inspect that kind of safety. So countries can have product standards that they can force across international boundaries. Imports have to meet those product standards, but so does domestic production. What sometimes gets a little iffy is, what if you don't have any domestic production? Now your product standard only applies to imports. And now those imports can sometimes be used as a way of limiting imports. It's also important, though, to recognize that product standards can also be used as a form of disguised protection. Now, you might think that this is really odd. Japan, however, has a very high quality standard for ski wax. Does everybody know what ski wax is? Okay. If you go skiing, one of the things you like to do is wax the underside of your skis or your snowboard so it slides on the snow better. So Japan has the highest product quality standards on ski wax in the world. There's one Japanese company that makes ski wax. One. I don't know how many employees they have, not very many. But I don't know if you've ever seen a map of Japan. It's a mountainous place. They don't have many ski runs. Right? So there are not a lot of skiers there. But you can go skiing in the United States, you wax it down. You go skiing in Europe, you wax it down. I'm sorry, that ski wax isn't good enough. U.S. companies, European companies have appealed this to the